Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Game of Thrones Season 7, Episode 1, Dragonstone. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Game of Thrones, so I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Game of Thrones up to Season 7, Episode 1. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So the long wait is finally over and Game of Thrones has finally returned. Feels so good to finally have new episodes of Game of Thrones to watch. And as far as first episodes of a season goes, this one wasn't so bad. In fact, I'd probably say it's one of the better season premieres that they've ever had. Sure, this episode wasn't mind-blowing and didn't have a lot of amazing revelations, but first episodes typically don't. Typically, the first episode of a season is a setup episode with a lot of character scenes that help establish the new dynamic of the season and transitions well from the previous season, and I think not only does this episode do that well, but better than most seasons. While some of the scenes were slow-paced, I wouldn't describe any of them as filler, as they helped build the characters more and set the stage for what is going to come in the season. So I think this episode was entirely necessary, and we needed to have it in order to fully fleshed out season, and one that doesn't seem too rushed. And although I wouldn't describe this as a great episode, it was interesting and well executed and has me really excited for the rest of the season. So I always love the opening sequence. I think it's one of the best on any show, and I was curious how they were going to do the map now that they no longer have Essos in the show. And it's true, for the first time the entire opening sequence took place in Westeros, but they just went a bit slower and replaced going to Essos with going to Old Town, which is the first time we see Old Town in the opening sequence, despite the fact that the show has been there before. But I absolutely loved it. I thought it was a great addition. They even had a miniature version of that sphere, the one that's in the opening sequence and the one we saw in Old Town at the big library, so it was a nice little touch. But before we got the opening sequence, this episode started with a cold opening, and for the record, this is the 5th time the show has started an episode with a cold opening. The first time was the very first episode of the show, which started with a cold opening of a group of Night's Watchmen getting attacked by the Waits. And the first episode of the 3rd season had a cold opening showing the aftermath after the White Walker attack at the Fist of the First Men. And then the next cold opening was in the Season 4 premiere, which opened with Tywin Lannister melting down ice and forging Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail. And the next cold opening was the first one to appear in an episode that wasn't a season premiere, and that was in episode 7 of season 6, which had the cold opening of the revelation that the Hound was still alive and with a group of religious villagers. So we get our 5th cold opening in this season 7 premiere, which makes seasons 2, 5, and 6 the only seasons not to begin with a cold opening. And what a great cold opening it was. I would say this is not only the best cold opening the show has ever done, but also the best way to start a season that the show has ever done. This scene was just pure gold, and the entire time I was watching it, I was giddy like a little girl, just slammed my chair, and I was just so happy. Even though I knew the scene was coming from the plot leaks, that didn't make it any less awesome to watch. In fact, regardless of any leaks, I would have easily been able to tell what was going to happen as soon as the scene started. As soon as I saw Walder Frey on the screen, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. It's not hard to figure out, especially when he starts talking about how he gathered all the Freys of any importance together for a feast and proposed a toast. I dare say it wasn't hard to figure out exactly what would happen after that toast. But it was even better than I could have imagined when Walder started talking about how they killed a pregnant woman and a mother of 5 and slaughtered guests that they invited into their homes. It was just so awesome. The Red Wedding was something that bothered many. I myself had mixed feelings about it, so it was so sweet that seeing that be avenged to the fullest. Arya's killing of Walder Frey was just the tip of it. Actually seeing her kill all of the Freys in the same way that they killed all of the Starks was brilliant. And I also liked how Arya left Walder's teenage wife and the server girls alive to send the message of what happened. And of course, I also think that Arya showed them mercy because she recognized them as victims of the Frey. So that's it for House Frey. I did find it interesting how further reference was made to this, as Jaime mentioned all the Freys were dead, and apparently the Lannisters even sent troops to keep the peace in the Riverlands. But I was really disappointed they didn't mention anything about who did it, because Arya made no secret that she was doing it for Stark revenge, and there were witnesses that clearly saw her changing faces. So I wonder if those witnesses are not believed, or if they do know the Starks did this. The one conclusion I would think that they would draw, like Cersei and Jaime and people like that, would be that the Starks hired a faceless man to assassinate the Freys. That would seem the most logical conclusion if they don't know about Arya. But, you know, despite that, I was a bit disappointed that it wasn't even talked about. I did love the scene, though, when Arya came across the Lannister men and ate and drank with them. I thought this was an extremely important moment for Arya, as Arya has always seen Lannister soldiers as evil men or enemies, and you couldn't blame her, considering what happened the last times she encountered Lannister soldiers in the Riverlands, who tortured innocents and killed her friends and nearly killed her. But it's interesting because this scene turned all of that on its head, where these soldiers were kind to her and they shared their food and drink, and even when they didn't have to. And they were also open about how, you know, their families. One of them talked about them missing their parents, another one about his newborn child, whom he doesn't even know if it's a boy or a girl. And it was interesting how he said he hoped it was a girl so she wouldn't be asked to die in somebody else's war, which again would force Arya to re-examine everything that she thought she knew. But I wasn't at all surprised when she said that she was going to King's Landing to kill the Queen, because I knew that would be her next priority, to finish off her kill list, which only has 2 names left on it now, Cersei and the Mountain. And I knew she didn't fear the Lannister soldiers, as she could just kill them all easily if she had to, which is why she didn't fear being so open and honest with them. In fact, I almost think she was somewhat hoping to provoke a fight, but they just laughed and took it as a joke, and it was cute seeing Arya laugh with them. I suppose she was laughing because she knew it was no joke, but it was great seeing her just enjoy being a girl and not always being about killing. So we get a scary shot of the White Walkers and a bunch of whites, including giants that are whites, I suppose just to remind us where the real threat lies. Then we see Bran coming out of a warging section, and I don't know if we're meant to take it that Bran was seeing all those whites through his warging or not, but either way, don't really think it matters. Anyway, there's not much to talk about in this Bran scene, as I was expecting to see a lot more of him in this episode, and I'm surprised that we didn't. And I'm not sure if Ed believed Mira about who they were, but he should, because I'm pretty sure Jon told him about his brother and how he traveled north of the wall, and if Jon didn't tell him, then that was pretty negligent on his part, seeing how he knew Bran was still north of the wall and Ed was now in charge of the wall. Anyway, Ed asks if they are wildlings, which does make me wonder what he would have done if they were wildlings. Would he have let them in? Because he should, seeing how the wildlings base is now south of the wall and other wildlings are looking to join them, should be allowed to pass. And plus, you don't want more fodder for the White Walkers' army, so probably I'll assume so anyway, because that would make the most sense. But I guess we'll have to wait for another episode to get Ed's interactions with Bran. So then we go to the scenes in the north, which were quite interesting indeed, as we see the Lords of the North meeting and deciding what to do next. And Jon's chief concern is of the White Walkers, and they mentioned the 2 major castles that are furthest north are the Last Hearth and Carhold, which so happen to be the 2 castles controlled by the families that betrayed the Starks and sided with the Boltons. So it's interesting that Jon overruled Sansa, who insisted those castles be given to the families that actually supported the Starks in their fight against the Boltons, because I can't actually say I disagree with Sansa, and While I agree with Jon that children shouldn't be held responsible for the sins of their older family members, it probably wasn't the wise thing to do, as it alienates the other lords, and as Sansa pointed out, the house that actually stood by them in their time of need should be rewarded. So I have a feeling that this decision will come back to bite them on the ass. And I like how Sansa even brings up Robb and Ned and saying that Jon needs to be smarter than them or he'll end up dead too, which is a pretty good point. And that Jon is being a bit naive here, and he doesn't have as much experience in politics as Sansa does. And it goes around doing the honorable thing like Ned and Robb did, it just won't work. But on the other hand, I see Jon's perspective that Sansa challenging his authority in front of his bannermen is completely unacceptable, as it would ultimately undermine his role. So ultimately, I do think Sansa wants what's best for Jon and the North and doesn't want to undermine him, but she's not completely confident in him either. And it's obvious that Littlefinger sees this conflict, and he's very likely to try to exploit it, but at least for the moment, it appears that Sansa is aware of how sleazy Littlefinger is, and that he's just looking out for himself, at least for now, but that could change. I also wanted to point out that when Jon tells Sansa about what their father said, about how everything someone says before the word but is horseshit, is a callback to season 1 when Benjen was talking to Tyrion. He also brings up what his brother used to say about how everything a man says before the word but doesn't mean anything. So that was a nice little callback. So I also liked how when Jon talked about training all the women and girls, as well as the men and boys, Lord Gover spoke out against it, that Lady Mormont defied him and said that she wouldn't let all the men die while she was by a fire knitting. It was so great getting some awesome Lyanna Mormont moments. There's a reason this character was so well liked. And you could see the look on Brienne's face while she said this. You could tell she was really proud of that statement. This is the first time we see Brienne and Lyanna Mormont together, I believe. I didn't really think about this, but it makes a lot of sense how much Brienne would respect her. And of course, it's interesting that Brienne is back in the North, as last time we saw her she was in the Riverlands, but seems she returned to the North and is still Sansa's trusted servant, although I did notice she didn't look pleased when Sansa challenged Jon. But later we see her training Podrick like she promised she would. She was just basically kicking his ass, but I think he'll definitely learn a thing or two from her. It was funny how Tormund called Pod a lucky man for getting his ass kicked by Brienne while he was making eyes at her. And I'm sure people are going to make all sorts of comments about a Brienne and Tormund hookup, but it's obvious that she doesn't share his feelings, so I don't really see that changing. But speaking of Tormund, it is interesting that Jon put him and the wildlings in charge of Eastwatch by the Sea. Even in the lore of the show, the Night's Watch are still there, but I suspect they will either ignore that lore or just rewrite it. It's kind of implied that the wildlings would take over more castles on the wall, but I suspect Eastwatch will be the only one touched on in the show, as Eastwatch was mentioned later in the episode with Beric and Thoros' vision in the fire, clearly setting it up as an important location in the fight against the White Walkers. Almost seems to me that they're implying that's where the White Walkers will attempt to cross, but I guess we'll just have to see. So I also liked the scenes with Cersei in King's Landing, as it was great to see she wasn't completely stupid and realized that her position is dangerous. I liked how she said she was Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and Jaime countered by saying, well, 3 at best. And I think those 3 that he's referring to are the Westerlands, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands. Although the Riverlands is technically not a kingdom and is part of the Iron Islands kingdom, but I suppose that's why he said at best, because Dorne and the Reach have sided with Daenerys, and the Vale has sided with the North, so definitely not those 4. And it's also interesting that Jaime finally confronts Cersei about the death of Tommen, and while Cersei expresses sadness over this, it seems she holds some contempt for him as well, as she referred to Tommen as betraying her, which I suppose refers to him taking the High Sparrow's side when the High Sparrow tried to seize control of the crown. So that's interesting. But the one thing that really bothered me was the fact that we didn't get an on-screen moment where Cersei learned that Tyrion was Daenerys' hand. That was a very vital moment that I feel robbed of by not getting to see it on screen. In fact, although Cersei does bring up the fact that Jaime saved Tyrion's life in order to shame Jaime, that they're really kind of understanding how much, they're understating how much Cersei hates Tyrion. In fact, this is one of the scenes in the episode I felt a bit rushed, and it was just dumping exposition on us, when in fact many of these moments should have played out on screen rather than just having Cersei and Jaime talk about it. So I feel a bit robbed of that as well. But Cersei's not stupid and understands the need for allies, as we see Euron arriving in King's Landing to make a pact with Cersei. And unlike Jaime, I think this was a really wise decision on Cersei's part. Although the one thing I'm confused about is when Jaime asks Cersei why Euron came, she says he's here for a queen, which seems to suggest she knows that he wants to marry her. But when he proposes marriage, she refuses. Is she just playing hard to get? Will she be more receptive to a proposal when he returns with this gift? We'll just have to see. But I really like the scene. I found the way that Jaime reacted to Euron very reminiscent to the way that Tyrion reacted to Theon when he sought a pact with Daenerys. So I like the parallels here. I also loved how when Euron proposed to Cersei, he mentioned he still had two good hands, and Jaime looked noticeably pissed off. I actually laughed at that. It was also interesting how when Cersei chastised him for killing his brother, he told her that she should try it. Now, the implications seem to suggest he was referring to Jaime because he was there, but I think it's more obvious that he was referring to Tyrion, since he is the brother that she wants to kill. So we also get a lot of Sam in Old Town, and I can just imagine all the complaints about how boring these scenes were, but actually I really liked them. They weren't the most exciting scenes in the world, but I felt absolutely necessary to show what Sam's life in Old Town is like, and he's basically just cleaning up other people's shit and doing other menial tasks, and so he isn't able to do what he set out to do, and that is to learn more about the White Walkers. And I found his interactions with the Archmaester, played by Jim Broadbent, very interesting. First of all, he's great in this role. What a perfect casting choice. And secondly, it was interesting how he noted he believed Sam about the White Walkers being real, but still didn't really care much about it. So Sam had to sneak into the forbidden section and steal the books that he needed. And it is interesting to see Gilly and the baby, that the baby actually seemed to have aged for once anyway, that they're living nearby. So we know Gilly's still nearby and that she can read now, and that was interesting too. But I hope that he does learn something interesting from these books, because in this episode the only revelation they got was that there was a lot of dragon glass at Dragonstone. But I was like, no duh. I mean, Sam even brings up the fact that Stannis has already told them this, so this should be no big revelation, and yet Sam feels the need to urgently write Jon about it. And of course, we get the reveal that Jorah is in Old Town, one of this, sick people who's being looked after, and it does make sense he would go to the Citadel to seek a cure for his grayscale, and I have no doubt we'll get more interactions between him and Sam. And then we get the scene with the Hound, with the Brotherhood Without Banners, stopping by that old farm which the Hound stayed at with Arya in season 4 and just stole the farmer's money, saying that he'll be dead by winter, which did in fact turn out to be the case. Now, given the Hound's interactions with Beric and Doros, where he still is just as belligerent as ever, I could see how one could draw the conclusion that the Hound hasn't really changed at all. But that's not true, as you really get a sense of how remorseful he was over the death of these farmers, where before he didn't give a damn about them. So quite a significant change in this character, and I found the scene where he was burying them quite touching. I also love the interactions with Beric and Thoros, as we haven't seen these characters in any significant way since season 3. So I think it's quite important to get to know them again for this coming season. Of course, it was also fascinating to see them convert the Hound to their cause, which is to stop the White Walkers. So finally, we come to Daenerys, who actually doesn't do much in this episode, and in an episode titled Dragonstone, we actually see very little of it. It's mostly just shows her arriving in Westeros for the first time since her birth, and I'll be honest, most of these scenes we saw in the trailers, so that kind of took the interest out of these scenes for me, because it felt like I had already seen them, because for the most part, I have. Like dozens of times. But the one thing I will say is that it does have me really excited to see what comes next with her. And also that I find it funny how Stannis was at Dragonstone for 3 seasons and we didn't see this much of it. Especially like this throne room, there's no hint that this even existed. The only really familiar setting was the room with the giant table of Westeros that has the dragon carved in the wall. But even those little wooden ship figures, I remember Stannis like tearing them apart when he got mad. So it'll be interesting to see this room again, but now with Daenerys in charge, so I just cannot wait. So my rating for Dragonstone out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. A very effective setup episode that does its job well and starts with the best opening scene any season has ever had. And although it could be a tad slow at times, I feel every moment served a purpose to set up the characters and situations, and it has me really excited for the rest of the season. So that's it for my review of Dragonstone. Be sure to check back here in a few days as I do a live discussion video with Abkin Tomko where we cover this episode in more detail. There's a link in the description below to the event which you can find out the time and date and when it will start. I'll also be back here later in the week for my further analysis video on this episode where I'll get to some spoilers involving the rest of the season and talk further about how this episode affected my predictions. So keep an eye out for that as well as I will continue to review every episode of Game of Thrones as it comes out. Also be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on other shows like Star Trek, Dark Matter, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.